¿Qué es eso? Mi nombre es Noelia. Yo nací en Chile. Yo soy de Santiago.
Soy de Venezuela y vivo en Chile.
¿Te gustaría que hiciéramos un juego?
Sí. ¿Cuál?
Yo te voy a mostrar una foto de un lugar
A ver.
y tú tienes que inventar una historia.
Muéstrame la foto que tienes ahí.
Tengo una.
Había una vez un hombre que viajó a otro país y se quedó a vivir en esta casa.
Había una familia que quería ir de vacaciones. En redes sociales vieron la foto de este lugar.
De loco ahora.
Locos Arms.
Mientras pescaban, encontraron un tiburón, pero no se los comió.
¿Puedes contarme qué lugar es este? Cuéntame la historia de este lugar.
Parque Nacional de Rapa Nui.
Capac Ñam.
Chiloé. ¿Qué nombre más raro?
Las oficinas de Humberstone y Santa Laura. ¿Está en Chile?
Está en Chile.
Asentamiento y momificación de la cultura chinchorro.
Ciudad minera de Sube.
Barrio histórico de Paraíso.
Chile.
De Valparaíso.
Yo pensé que era, no sé, otro país.
Fueron construidas con técnicas indígenas y europeas.
Genial.
Ya supe un poquito que en Chile hay momias antiguas.
Me llamó mucho la atención que aquí pudieran construir casas cuando es un desierto.
Es un lugar que es patrimonio mundial.
¿Oh? Nunca había sabido eso.
El patrimonio mundial es algo demasiado importante. Es como la Torre Eiffel.
En otros países, en el mundo, nadie más lo tiene.
Los podemos cuidar restaurándolos.
No destruyendo casi nada. Amarla, quererla, protegerla entre todos.
Me gustaría que me enseñaran más cosas del patrimonio.
O sea, para conocer más nuestro país.
Chile tiene
7 sitios de patrimonio mundial. Son únicos en el mundo.
Y cuidarlos es muy importante.
Todavía queda mucho
Por aprender.
parte de nuestra cultura.
Que puedan tomar asiento, vamos a empezar en breve y les recuerdo también el uso de la mascarilla. Muy buenos días. Vamos a dar inicio entonces a la actividad. Les quiero pedir que por favor puedan poner en modo avión o silenciar sus celulares también para poder disfrutar de esta actividad.
Mute them so we can start with this activity.
Un día como hoy, hace justo 50 años, comenzaba a sesionar con invitados e invitadas de diversos países y disciplinas de la región la mesa sobre el desarrollo y el papel de los museos en el mundo contemporáneo. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos al lanzamiento de las actividades conmemorativas y reflexivas por el cincuentenario de la Mesa Redonda de Santiago de Chile. Revisiones del pasado, problemáticas del presente y desafíos del futuro. Encuentro y reflexión crítica sobre el rol de los museos desde Latinoamérica y el Caribe al mundo. Convocará a partir de hoy a diversos actores de la región en el marco de los 50 años de la histórica reunión desarrollada entre el 20 y 31 de mayo de 1972.
May 20 and 31 of 1972. This new edition of the Santiago Roundtable, organized by the Chilean Committee of Museums ICOM Chile and the Regional Education Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, Oreal UNESCO Santiago, seeks to revisit history, identifying the current trends and the joint opportunities of joint efforts in the development of museology with active participation of communities. This activity has simultaneous interpretation in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and it's being broadcasted through YouTube from the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean of UNESCO. Before beginning this event, we would like to invite you to participate in the activities that are going to be held in a virtual or remote manner on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, 6th, 7th, and 8th of June, respectively, through the YouTube channel of UNESCO Santiago. These dialect spaces will have the participation of different guests from Argentina, Barbados, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, France, the US, Mexico, and Peru. You may find the full activities program at museoschile.gov.cl, Mesa Redonda de Santiago. We'd like to invite Marina Palina Sotolave, Undersecretary of Cultural Heritage, to please begin this Congress with a few opening words. Very well. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. The prior invitation had to do with honoring a building, which is much more than a building. Therefore, I do think that we have two continuity rituals between that event and the other 50 years. We'd like to greet all the workers and everyone that's made this activity possible, everyone that is connected and that will continue connected with the roundtables. This is quite relevant. This is historical loop we have 50 years later. Of course, the authorities that are accompanying us here in the world of museums, would like to thank them as well in the world of memory, in the world of heritage. Therefore, So I hope those words can greatly contribute to you. Would like to honor the Santiago Roundtable of 1972 because it is a milestone. And it's an international conversation that, at the time, put museums in their critical role, being a territory of relationships where we need to visually stimulate reflection and public debate on the issues of society. Museums cannot continue being buildings that hold collections. This conversation happened in Chile, and that was no coincidence because here we were gathering all the Latin American specificities in the context of countries that are not aligned and within the context of a Cold War. Chile was elevating as a territory for dreams and possible and pertinent, relevant imaginaries to our own realities. 50 years from this dialogue interruption, we are able to recover that spirit of era that went beyond the barriers of what is possible to open to social and political transformations that are ongoing. Because just like today we have different violences that are affecting our cultural institutions, intervening the curatorial lines, the literary script of the exhibitions, heritage tour, even the collections per se, and of course to the communities that are currently an integral part of our museums. Harmonizing with the adjustment of each area and getting the institutional missions is not only something that is discursive or aesthetic, it's something that is ethical. This crisis, we have hope, and it's hope that is open to many places in the world. And we've produced a trend that is specific for this era, making heritage, citizenship of heritage. We have the national states in their capacity to provide the basic conditions and equitable conditions of subsistence to survival to populations is increasing. Group awareness and academic awareness is also increasing. The need of negotiating identities, and that's where we can find the bodies that come from different matrices. Cultural jus sanguinis, we would say in a language. Cultural intermittence is here to stay in every place of the planet, and our workers and heritage and inheritance and museums in all those topics, they very well know this. So we're opening debates that hopefully are not so dichotomic, just like the sentences that I will read as follows. Museum that installs national versus a museum that gets the identity, community identity. Homogenization, national homogenization versus plurinational diversity. Operation of patrimonialization versus self-determination and community construction. What we must or must not conserve, preserve, and for how long, right? I always say this. And sharing from belonging, the feeling of belonging, identity. All these are complex decisions, but they're critical. Urban buildings, milestones of centralism versus the decentralization, territorial decentralization, and all of its forms today that are quite related with territories, natural landscapes, when we talk about even seeds, right, and the patrimonialization. Fossilization or dynamism. Everything that is coming in the next decades, which is repatriation of pieces of museums from the north to the south of the country. Finally, I'd like to note that this sector, in order to face these issues that are quite complex, within the plane of institutional culture that has a long-standing tradition of dialogue and participation, which will certainly face all these complex challenges, because I do believe that from the cultural, from the 19th onwards, we've always gathered between different stakeholders to reinforce that inheritance. Everything that we have with us in our body, that inheritance we carry with us in our body. So I'd like to conclude with this invitation for us to face these themes that, of course, 50 years later pose more questions than solutions. So thank you very much, and let's have a great day. We'd like to thank the Undersecretary for her words, and the Ministry of Culture, Arts and Heritage for their contribution to this initiative. We'd like to invite now Nicolás del Valle Orellana, a coordinator that's responsible for culture of UNESCO Chile, to please come to the stage. Hello, how are you? Good morning, everyone. Friends, female friends, fighters for the culture in Chile in times of change. Good morning to everyone that is connecting now through our online broadcast and through everyone that is accompanying us today. On behalf of Ecuador, Rivera, Director of the Regional Office of UNESCO in Chile, Latin America and the Caribbean, and representative of this organism in Chile, and on behalf of them, it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this historical event. And we are celebrating the 50 years of the Santiago Roundtable in Chile, and it's inviting us to rethink about the role of museums with the communities in our region. This is not only a national event, this is an event that's also for Latin America and the Caribbean, right? We'd like to thank you for all the lectures, national and international lectures that will participate in today's activity, and the 3 days we will have on the 6th, 7th, and 8th of June through the YouTube channel of UNESCO Santiago. I'd like to greet the Undersecretary of Heritage, of Cultural Heritage, Mrs. Paulina Soto. Likewise, I'd like to take this opportunity to greet the President of the Chilean Committee of Museums, ICOM Chile, Mr. Leonardo Osales, and the Executive Director of GAM and its Chairman and President, Felipe Mella and Tomas Peters, respectively. We would like to thank you very much for holding this event. It was just 50 years later in this historical building, recognized in 1972 as UNCTAC 3, and then recognized as the Cultural Metropolitan Center, Gabriela Mistral. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? Let's try to continue. 50 years have passed since representatives from the museums and citizens from different fields, they got together in Santiago, Chile to discuss and reflect on the roles of these cultural spaces in society. In this regard, this activity is key to critically reflect on the transforming roles of museums in relationships with people, territories, and their communities. Likewise, this drives the encounter between representatives and specialists of the museology of different countries, with a common committed view to respond to the current challenges that the cultural institutions are facing. Likewise, we are noting the participation of children and the youth who will converse about the roles of museums in the 21st century. Let's not forget that the Santiago Roundtable in 1972 set the foundations for a new museology in the Santiago Declaration. Now, this instance that we're celebrating today, it inspires the technical recommendations of UNESCO related to the protection and promotion of museums' collections, their diversity, and their role in society. Those recommendations from 2015. The new definition of museum is something that we're currently driving by the International Council of Museums. And I'm not trying to have a definition or a concept here with you. Having said that, we can at least state that museums are spaces that are at the service of society, that contribute decisively to ensuring not only the right to culture and the enshrinement of cultural rights like participation, right? But education of quality that is transforming, that is relevant with communities and their territories through the participation of students and teachers in the cultural and artistic life of Chile. Museums are key agents in this challenge that we have globally, which is not to leave anyone aside or behind. To drive the contribution of museums in society means that we need to extend this beyond formal education, to broaden the perspective of cultural rights beyond access, linking the educational places with cultural spaces and driving creativity, identity, cultural inheritance, citizenship, and learning. In this regard, efforts such as the National Policy for Museums, they make up a significant milestone that is driven by Chile. It was driven in 2018. And recently we have other efforts such as the National Forum for Artistic Education that we drove as UNESCO in 2021 with support from the Ministry of Culture, Arts, and Heritage. And that provides or shine lights on the transformational power of museums in the different territories. This encounter today is a space necessary to look into the past, valuing culture, museums, and the different stakeholders and agents that have been strongly affected by the pandemic. Today, we are initiating a cycle for reflection and memory, which will, of course, contribute to go deep into dialogue of the right of culture within the framework of the constituent process that Chile is going through now. Finally, I'd like to thank the work of the Executive and International Committee, many wills, people, institutions, that everyone that makes this cycle possible, which is awoken interest from different countries. Without further ado, I'd like to say goodbye now, and hope we have a great encounter. And I'd like to invite you to actively participate in the next activities, which will be gathered and collected in a document in the second Santiago Roundtable that we will start writing. Welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolás. Now it's time for Leonardo Bellado González, President of the Chilean Committee of Museums, ICOM Chile. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, since you're watching from other places. I'm pretty nervous. Because today we started where we started a long time ago. And this is why I'm glad to have this group of people that with warmth and affection and love struggle to work with community through museums, a fundamental social tool. From ICOM Chile, we be committed to commemorate the roundtable, Santiago's roundtable, for long years ago, particularly as of 2016 when we initiated with the presidencies of Beatriz Espinosa, who now presides ICOM Lati, and I appreciate and support her presence. There's been a whole reflection process around the Santiago's roundtable, added to many other reflection and commemoration processes held for a long time. Caracas was one of them, and it's worth mentioning. We started a research line, an academic line with the lecture Katemotni, and a special appreciation and recognition to the nice museologic practices through the Desmosny Award. As a matter of fact, I can see Darío Aguilera in the audience, director of the La Ligua Museum. That was the first museum to be awarded this denomination, and will continue doing so during this year. This instance, to us, is a very emotional instance, because it is not just a reflection instance around the past. Neither it is through a nostalgic look. This is what we've been talking about as of the first moment. And let me cap it up, let me summarize, based on the exercise we've been doing in ICOM Chile. We were having a conversation with Nicolás del Valle, and precisely after a museologic exercise, we had the chance to gather. And we gathered to think, and we need to do something. That was what we talked about. And we started to embark on that idea, and we called, and we were heard. Cultural institutions took part, the Ministry of the Cultures, the Undersecretary, So once more, I thank your presence and the Secretary. The National Service of Heritage, I can see in the audience, its Director Javier Diaz. Thank you for joining us. At that point, Carlos Maye and more people. I had a list, but before going to the list, I just need to point out that this meeting will take us to a reflection work on the museums of today for future, based on some principles. This roundtable should be diverse. It should be integrated and integral, and integrating, parity, transdisciplinary, intergenerational, with a territorial and regional focus. Regional in the local sense and regional in the sense of Latin America, even broader, making proposals and being contextual. We also define some themes. The Santiago Roundtable tasks for today and from yesterday: museums, territories, communities, and new museologies. Development, underdevelopment, Roundtable Santiago, subject Santiago, sustainability, practices for the good living at present, sociological inequalities, socio-educational practices. Those would be the axes and the pillars we'll be working around today and on June 6, 7, and 8. And although it's been an institutional effort, as I said, this wouldn't be possible without the effort and participation of the communities. Museums have been created by people. In those, people work, and they empty their creativity for people. Thus, the main axis should always be people. And this is why I wanted to highlight, to emphasize each one of the people that directly, because indirectly it's been an endless list, have been participating and cooperating in this instance. Nicolás Rojas and Nicolás del Valle from the regional office, they have been tremendous partners in order to hold this instance. So big round of applause for them. I must say it, impressive work. Hugh de Barin, who's now from France and who started with the same round table. He's been with us during the whole process, suggesting, proposing, motivating. Neuran Bonilla from Costa Rica, who's also with Brunon, have been the president heading a process for the new definitions of museums that today, in the very morning, closed the proposal to be presented in the General Conference of Prague by the end of August. Mario Chagas, many times with us and many times present in these instances. That would be on an international level, but also on nationwide scale. We are part of an executive committee also contributing with their presence. At some point it was Carlos Mayer, today is Javier Diaz, Alan Trump. Many of us are in this position for the second time. Nicolás del Valle, Beatriz Espinosa, they've been with us through all the time. Karin Weil, who also, well, we're not just friends, but I have to acknowledge and recognize her participation. Marisol Facusen from the University of Chile, Alejandra Raya also from the Universidad de Chile. The whole Universidad de Chile team is over there along with the Universidad Austral team. Many thanks to them, many thanks. I'd like to acknowledge your commitment, your work. Luis Alegría from the National Historical Museum, one tremendous panel, always with us with the lectures of Katemosni in these commemoration instances. Enrique Rivera, who recently joined us throughout the way by ending the process from the Interactive Museum, suggesting strategies for working with children. And of course, I would like to particularly thank Felipe Mella through Solange Roballo, who's been the representative of the institution helping us greatly So all this team present here, production, all the team, it's been a great work, a tremendous team, very professional, always supporting us. I apologize if I'm forgetting someone now. I insist, I'm very nervous and very anxious that everything works out well for you, for the people. Thank you very much. We thank Alejandro Medalla, and finally we invite Felipe Mella Morales, Executive Director of the Cultural Center Gabriela Mistral, for his welcoming words. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As the Undersecretary was mentioning, as well as Nicolas, to us it is very important this year because we will be 50 years of the opening of this big building called Gabriela Mistral. We've been through several emotions, particularly in April that weekend when we were able to contact and group the managers, the artists present in this great project, which is Untitled 3, and then it became the Metropolitan Cultural Center Gabriela Mistral. And for that dark point in our story, held in Gabriela Mistral, back then it was Diego Portales Center, follows the path of that dream of building this venue. Along with the rest of my team, I would like to welcome you. I would like to greet the Undersecretary of Heritage and the Ministry of Culture, Alan Trump, and the Director of National Service on Heritage, Nicolás del Valle, on behalf of Ricardo Salazar, Director of the Regional Office of Education for Latin America and the Caribbean, Beatriz Espinosa, President of the Strategic Partnership of ICOM in Latin America, Javier Diaz, Deputy Director of the Heritage Service, Leonardo Mellado González, President of the Chilean Committee ICOM Chile, Sven Karenburg, and the Vice Rector, Deputy Vice Rector and Director of Communications in behalf of Ennio Vivaldi, and all the directors of museums and cultural institutions. GAM is not a museum. Nevertheless, both the building that preceded it and held Untitled host an important cultural aspect. You can see it through its work. They were born with the purpose of reaching citizenship rather than being there as a building. Their intention was to be there with people, many of them to be touched and not only to be looked from a distance. As of 2017, along with the museums from the neighborhood, we want to have a similar exercise, to be out of our four walls and try to approach people. Because before all, above all, we are very conscious about the important cultural capital gap in our societies. In the same way, UNESCO in 1972, in the same building, called to have a round table about development and the role of museums in the contemporary world. This time, GAM continues to pay honor by calling and gathering cultural spaces and communities to create a way to inhabit the territory with a basis of coexistence around sensitive presence of culture. Nowadays, history gathers us together again to strengthen this purpose, the same purpose that under the context of the social upheaval in 2019 move us as a society, and particularly us being located in this zone. It shows us that we were going on the right path. And I dare to say that all our cultural spaces make us react in a good way, open us to dialogue, to hold all those that nothing will be the same after this. I don't know if the answer was the proper one, politically speaking. We are not aware or certain if this changed the way to relate to each other with our communities and audience. What I do know is that the space, Barrio Harto, MAC, MAVI, and GAM, people express respect and affection they felt before the social upheaval. And from there, our responsibility is to deliver an experience strengthening the ties between culture, territories, and communities. To end, I'd like to thank UNESCO and ICOM for inviting us to this new version of the Santiago Roundtable 50 years later as a way to remind one of the more lightening episodes in Chilean culture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Felipe, for holding us today in GAM Center. We also greet workers from the participating organization who have collaborated for the organization of this meeting. It is time now to start the opening conference, Roundtable Talks of Yesterday, their current reading. This segment will have a conversation with interlocutors in Paris, Coyhaique, and Santiago. We greet in first place to the historian and museologist friend from France, Hughes de Barin, who was the president of the International Council of Museums ICOM in 1972 and participated of the Santiago Roundtable precisely 50 years ago. We also welcome the Colombian museologist Ana María Rojas Monera and Leonardo Mayado, president of the Chilean Committee of Museums. Those who are following us can send the question through the YouTube channel, and we internally guided them to Leonardo Mellado. Once more time, I think you can see Hugh de Barin and Ana María Rojas. I can see them on the screen. Quite interesting, you see, working virtually. Well, before we kick off, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our panelist, Hugh de Barin, is an independent, a freelance consultant. He's been retired, particularly in local and community development, and particularly through the management of natural and cultural heritage on local communities. He mainly worked in local projects in France, Brazil, Portugal, and Italy. And I'm certain he has a special affection for Latin America. He's been the director of the International Council of Museums between 1965 and 1974, and he has been in several positions in the French administration in the third sector, local development, urban generation. He has published several books on cultural imperialism in communities, initiatives, and heritage as a resource for local development. On the other hand, Ana María Rojas is also with us. She's museologist resident in Coyhaique, in the Chilean Patagonia, master's degree in studies of museums of Leicester University in England, and a professional in international relations of the North University of Barranquilla in Colombia. She's director of the research project Museology in Aysén, History of Museums and Narratives in an Isolated Territory, funded by the Cultural Heritage Fund. She's worked in Colombia, Chile, and England museums in collections interpretations, conceptual development, and design for exhibitions. She's curator, and she conducts museographic projects throughout the communities of Aysén, and she's an associated researcher to Austral University Chile, Campus Patagonia. She says she loves birds and their conservation, something really important. The methodology we'll conduct in this instance is as follows. There will be several questions previously prepared, and they will start triggering the dialogue and the conversation between Hugh de Barin and Ana María. These questions are directly related to the main theme we are all here today to commemorate, regarding the reflection of the past, but also present and future. Let's start with the past. Before the Santiago Roundtable were formed in 1972, which were the important reasons motivating its implementation, and why in Latin America
I suppose I have to answer
Supongo
that
que tengo que responder
because
esto, ¿no?
I
Porque
was there.
claramente yo
Anna Maria
estaba ahí,
wasn't.
efectivamente. Y claro, Ana María no lo estaba.
Well, I think we should answer the second question.
Deberíamos responder la segunda pregunta en primer lugar.
Why America Latina?
¿Por qué Latinoamérica?
Because it was
Y debo
a
decir que,
UNESCO program
porque fue un programa de la UNESCO,
for museums at that
de
time,
museos, que en ese momento, durante esas décadas,
70, 60,
los años
80,
60, 70 y
they
80,
decided every
decidieron
4 or 5 years
hace 4 o 5 años organizar
a meeting,
un encuentro regional
to answer requests
para dar
from
respuesta a
countries,
las
from
solicitudes
museums in
que los
various
museos
countries, various
de los
regions of the
países,
world,
de las regiones distintas
and
del
to
mundo
help,
hacían,
that was
y
the
también para
principle,
apoyar,
to
para
help,
ayudar, que fue una de las
these
razones
countries
principales, ayudar a
to
dichos países
modernize or
a
to develop
modernizar e
their
incluso
museums
desarrollar sus museos,
according to
de acuerdo
rules,
con
principles,
distintas normas, principios,
standards of
estándares
the museology,
de la
as they
museología.
were in, and that's important,
Y esto es importante
in
decirlo, dado que
Western world.
estaban en el mundo occidental.
At that time,
En esa época,
museology
la museología
essentially a museology
era particularmente y
derived
fundamentalmente una
from
museología
practice in
de
Western
una
Europe
práctica
and
más relevante
North America.
o con mayor frecuencia en Europa y en
Even the
Norteamérica.
museums of the South,
Incluso
some
los
of the
museos
oldest
propiamente
museums
tal,
of the
algunos
South
de los más
were
antiguos
run
del
and
sur,
managed,
eran administrados
according to the same
de acuerdo
kind
con el mismo
practices, the same
tipo
kind
de
of
prácticas y
as the
principios,
museum in the north,
tal cual se hacía en el norte.
in the Western world. So we had there was a meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1958. It was the first one, I think, of that series. A second one in 1964 was held in Nigeria for the whole of the whole of Africa. A third one was organized in 1966 in India, in New Delhi, for South and Southeast Asia. And the fourth one was to be held in 1972. No, there was one in Baghdad. Don't remember. It was, I think, it maybe 67 or something like that. But there was the last one was to be organized in Latin America in 1972. That was decided by UNESCO according to their program of regional meetings on museums. They asked ICOM, of which I was director at the time, they asked ICOM to help organizing this meeting. That was the first time. I personally participated in the meeting in Nigeria. I participated in the meeting in India, but I was not an organizer. I didn't organize. I was just a sort of observer. I was part of the Western group, which took part in the regional meetings. For Latin America, they asked me and a UNESCO program specialist called Raymond Frein, a friend of mine and my correspondent in UNESCO, to organize with Great Mosny and the Chilean authorities to organize the meeting. Why Chile? I don't know. That was decided by the top levels of UNESCO. So I was told it was beginning of 1972. I was told that it should happen in Chile. And I was given Great Mosny as my correspondent in Chile. So I started discussing with the UNESCO people, Raymond Frein and others, and corresponding with Great Mosny. But you must realize that at that time, the contacts with a country as far as Chile was made by letters. Letters took sometime 2 weeks to reach the correspondent, or we could work on with cables. We practically never talked on the phone. So the organization was really a sort of game which took months and took some understanding from the various participants. So UNESCO did the recruiting of the participants, the invitations to the different museums in the different countries concerned were decided by UNESCO with the collaboration of the national delegation to UNESCO. It was a very not say dictatorial, but still organized system at the national and international levels, intergovernmental levels. And we were supposed to organize the agenda, the themes, and so on. Here, I took the floor, so to speak, because at that time I had visited most regions of the world. I knew a little bit of the problems of museums, but also the problem of the countries. In the various countries I had visited for ICOM, and not only about museums, of course. And I knew, with my experience of the Nigerian meeting and the Indian meeting, regional meetings, I knew that this system of a sort of teaching by Northwestern so-called experts to the supposed less advanced museologists in the various regions of the world was not satisfactory. And also the theme of the roundtable was Latin America today, was to talk about the development of Latin America. So not only museums, but it was about museums, but for Latin America today, 1972. So with Raymond Frein, we discussed that problem, and we thought that it was important to not to try to teach museology to Latin American museologists, but to open some windows, some information about some serious information about some of the major topics and the major themes of the development of Latin American countries, and to do it with experts, but with Latin American experts. That was the first principle. The second principle, which I think is important, is that we decided not, as we did in the other regions, Nigeria or Asia, to do it in French and English. We decided to do it exclusively in Spanish. Although Raymond Frein and myself, we didn't speak Spanish. So that was a little strange, because we organized it in French or English, and it was decided officially to have it only in Spanish. And we started defining the names, finding the names of the people who could teach, who could not teach, who could intervene in the round table. My personal choice for the first keynote speaker was to ask Paulo Freire from Brazil, educator, famous at that time for his method and theories and principles, but that was vetoed by the Brazilian delegation to UNESCO, who didn't want, for political reasons, didn't want Paulo Freire, who at that time was in exile in Europe, to speak officially as Brazilian to a Latin American meeting. So we invited several Latin American experts. You have them in the list of the participants. And Paulo Freire was replaced on the agenda by an Argentinian called Jorge Ardoy, whom I didn't know, but who happened to be probably a very, very good speaker at the round table, because he was specialist of the evolution of the Latin American metropolis, and he started his day of explanation by talking about Mexico, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, etc., and explaining what was the real present time evolution of the major metropolis of Latin America. And I think that was very important for the evolution of the meeting. So to answer Leonardo's question, the reasons, it was our reasons, Raymond Frey and I, not UNESCO's reasons, not the Latin American willingness. The Latin American countries didn't know exactly what we were doing in preparing the meeting. They wanted a round table because that was their place in the list of round tables, of UNESCO round tables, to do it then in Santiago. But in fact, it was organized with Great Mosny, of course, because we discussed that with her by correspondence. And it was the razones de fondo, the reasons were more our reasons, a sort of political, so-called political decision to open this museum conference to the present day situation of Latin American countries in agriculture, education, urban development, nature. That's it. That's my interpretation. I'm old. I don't remember everything, but I have a clear vision of the round table at that time, although I didn't speak Spanish, so I was absolutely incapable to understand the debates of the meeting. I was just an observer. I was just present, but I can explain now the why we did that in that way. That was, for us, it was a very important principle. Latin American museums should decide for themselves which kind of museum they wanted.
Very well, thank you very much. That was a quite clarifying proposal from Hughes, right? Because throughout time, we've had a romanticization, a sort of romantic nature of the Santiago Roundtable and that constitution. It's in that regard what we provided a perspective that is more current. So in that regard, I'd like to ask Ana Maria to contribute from that vision on the realization of the Santiago Roundtable in Latin America.
Gracias, Leonardo.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Precisely in 1972, I was not even born or planned. I was born in 1992. So the comment I will make is based on the interpretations that I've made not only of the round table, but of this type of statement or declaration as a phenomenon within museology. Therefore, this is how I see this. Throughout history, museums, these institutions, and I'm also referring to museological projects such as a declaration or statement, have always responded to different forces. And they've adopted the roles they have in the case of museums to social-economic factors, to benefit-based situations according to their context, right? And that has made we can't talk about a linear history of museums, or that this always happens in the same manner, right? We will always have a model of museum per se, but since, well, I believe this, and based on many authors I follow, I believe that there's no model of museum that is essential. Of course, it's logical that these type of situations, such as the rupture proposed by the Round Table, it's quite great for it to have rupturistic for it to have happened in the 70s, right? So I thought about two reasons. One is the social aspect, and the other one has to do with the development of museology itself. The social reasons, we mentioned them now when we had the introduction for this encounter, and it's precisely that Latin America was in a complex context. We were going through this represented many repressive policies that wanted to eradicate everything that's related with critical awareness, with the intellectual awareness. In Colombia at a time, starting from the 50s, we initiated a civil conflict that remains up to now, to our days, and we're trying to solve this, but it was an epoch or an era of many things boiling, per se. And I think that they mixed the ingredients for one declaration in the field of museums to happen. And moreover, I'm going to go to the second set of reasons. This happened because we in Latin America, we came from a museological tradition that was from the 19th century, with museums that were built in the 1800s after the independence from the European countries, right, to consolidate an idea of a nation. Therefore, we're still struggling with these, or battling the hegemonic ideas of specific museums that represent a nation as a unified entity that represents a unique narrative, where different groups, minorities, for example, that are not even minorities like ethnical communities, did not feel represented in those speeches or discourses. So that's how I represent this. We came from this tradition that we still have, and in the 70s, in the face of this movement, and here in Chile, between the 60s and the 70s, there's also an ecological awareness, right, and social awareness that emerged. And we started generating regional museums and the professionalization of museum workers. Therefore, I believe that all this mixed all these ingredients, and we generated a declaration with the interest of breaking the paradigm of these museums that were representing these hegemonical narratives that were presented nations under this idea that erased other epistemologies, right? It's out of this mixture or mixed race were all just one, so they didn't represent the struggles that certain peoples are going through, just like, for example, African American, Afro descendant populations or indigenous peoples. So, this unique narrative in the museum, we wanted to, museologists at the time, they looked for a declaration to make that change. And within the field of the development of exhibitions, which is the area that I'm currently working the most at, when you review the literature of the 70s and 80s, they didn't even speak about a social museum. I'm talking about from the point of view of English museology, right? They didn't even talk about social museum or community participation as a requirement to have a sustainable museum. They spoke about exhibitions as methodological processes that were well structured and nothing could fail, right? Nothing could go wrong. And in the 90s or the 21st century, where we talk about co-curatorship in the English-speaking world. So I believe it's interesting to see how all these ingredients add up together and to show the declaration or statement as the daughter of its time, that show that the museums are not created under a same model in all the stages of history. That is what I believe. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. Hugh Tiberine and Ana Maria Rojas, both of them have proposed that the constitution of the Round Table of Santiago is due to a vertical reason in the sense of disorganization and the approaches expected. The Santiago Round Table sets the basis for this. Nevertheless, since we constituted this idea of social museums or the social role of museums, there's the creation of community-based museums and eco-museums, right? And the integral museums. Nevertheless, of course, there were some paradoxes, right? So what was the participation of communities in the resolutions, or did you only concentrate in specialists?
Sorry. You must remember that at the Santiago meeting, the participants were all museum directors or museum professionals from major national museums. They had nothing to do, they couldn't imagine anything outside their big museum. At that time, 1972, there were no community museums, no eco museums, nothing. There were public museums or private collection in North of America, but usually public museums, mostly national or in major capital cities. Some more specialized museum like archaeological museum or ethnographical museums locally, but practically nothing else. So we have to realize that it was the Santiago Declaration was the result of 2 or 3 people within the meeting, participant in the meeting. The leader was clearly Mario Vasquez from Mexico, because he had been for since 1963, 64, at the time of the inauguration of the big national museum in Mexico City. He had been very conscious of the fact that these big museums were only for the elite and mostly for tourists, or for the education of the already educated classes in the capital cities. The second one, who was very active in Santiago, was Carlos de Sola from Salvador, who was at that time 24 years old, and who really was one of the major, besides Mario Vasquez, writers, so to speak, drafters of the declaration. Also, there had been, I think, some important input from I don't remember the name, the lady who was a friend of mine from Colombia, who was director of the National Museum in Bogota, but she was essentially an anthropologist, so she understood this kind of thing, the importance of the different population in her country, and the importance for the museum. But she was mostly, at that time, many museums in many countries of Latin America were museum of gold. I mean, and they collected pieces of gold. And that was even the National Museum of Ecuador was a museum of the central bank of Ecuador. So the phenomenon of community museum, eco museums, etc., indigenous museums, and so on, happened later, much later. There had been some first examples before Santiago, for instance, the Anacostia Museum in Washington, D.C. There had been an experience in Niamey, in Niger, in Africa, in French-speaking Africa at that time. There had been some experience. Had been the experience I was part of in Le Creusot in France, but they were exceptions. They were experiences which were not really important for disseminating new ideas, and they were not from Latin America, except for personal impressions or personal convictions of Mario Vasquez in Mexico. So the idea of community participation in museums, in my memory, maybe I'm wrong, but in my memory, didn't even exist at that time. Mario Vasquez had the idea, and that's why he created the Casa del Museo afterwards, 2 years later. But it was really an exception. We must not think that there is a link between Santiago and this new museology movement. New museology, the idea of a new museology happened only at the end of the 70s and in the 80s. The idea of community museums and so on happened much later. Eco museums developed, apart from some cases in France or in Canada, have developed in the 90s, in fact, 80s and 90s. So the influence of the Santiago meeting was very weak in the first decade of 70. It was also weak in the 80s, and that's why Hernán Crespo Toral, who had been a participant in Santiago, and who became Assistant Director General of UNESCO for Culture later, Hernán Crespo from Ecuador decided to organize the Caracas meeting in 1992 to discuss the consequences and the follow-up to the Santiago meeting 20 years after Santiago. So we must keep this agenda, this in the memory. Santiago was very important intellectually, was very important 20, 30 years later. It has become a sort of some Bible later in the 90s, and then in the years 2000. I saw that in Brazil. The many groups, networks of museums in various states of Brazil began to talk about Santiago, about the Santiago Declaration and so on. At the end of the 90s and the beginning of the year 2000. But that's my memory. I'm not sure I'm right.
No estoy seguro, sí. No estoy seguro, pero no soy académico, no he realizado investigaciones al respecto.
Living memory which tells me that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, in fact, yesterday we were, remember Alan Trump, the declaration of Salvador de Bahia is another instance that is quite close, where the states do assume some type of acknowledgement to the Santiago Roundtable that in turn is like a sort of roadmap, right? But that is related to our second question. So I'd like to give Ana Maria I'd like to ask her position regarding this question number 2, regarding what's the role of specialists and the participation of communities in this first Santiago Roundtable.
Sí, yo estuve pensando y en realidad me parecía que el hecho de
Well, I've been thinking, and as a matter of fact, I thought that having this declaration by a group of specialists at that point shouldn't be qualified as positive or negative, because they belong to a cultural elite, or they currently belong, you see. Hughes is here too, but as of that moment when they gathered in Santiago, and I believe that community participation in terms of what we obviously can think of about community museums or communities conducting museologic processes was given by specialists who had activities themselves in the field. And I would like to mention, well, Hughes didn't remember the name, but the name is Alicia Dusan. Alicia Dusan is a pioneer in Colombian anthropology, in social sciences, human social sciences. And as a matter of fact, I think that last year she was celebrated 100 years through some homages in Colombia. And this anthropologist has been tremendously important in Colombia, particularly because through her studies, fieldwork in the territory, helped various indigenous communities when it came to land claiming, and their studies contributed for organizing these claims or complaints through her organization. And she's also considered as a promoter of conservation of the cultural legacy in Colombia. And precisely in the 70s, she was the head of the Museums and Restoration lead, or what today is the Colombian Museum. At that time, it was the Cultural Colombian Institute. So without a doubt, a pioneer such as Alicia Dusan brought and compiled that experience in the field directly from communities greatly affected from a Colombian context to bring it up here. This is my interpretation, my own interpretation, because I was not there, I was not during the declaration. But I could believe the same by analyzing the work and the impact or what she did in Colombia, along with all her contributions. This is what I still believe, and that is still happening. As a matter of fact, when we were talking to Hughes, trying to get some ideas for this conversation, we remember that the declaration emphasizes certain specialists, not only from museology, but from different knowledge areas that at that time arrived and presented the museologists the Latin American reality. Alicia's work, she did it in the field, but we knew that there were plenty of more people, and from what I have read and from what I heard from Hughes, there were some people that really felt didn't were that connected to the territory because they were based in some museums mainly located in the capitals. And if we look at the analysis conducted for the roundtable, it is always emphasized when it comes to the surprise this analysis generated due to the high growth of cities, rural crisis at that time, the incorporation of new technologies, and education seen as a fundamental social role by museums. So I always had this idea in my mind, an idea that could be paradoxical. Whereas some could have the knowledge in local context as Colombia and also on an international level, as it could be delivered by people like Hughes and other participants like Brett Mosney. And this is what I believe in relation to that participation, something you shouldn't weigh it as a negative or positive, but it's a participation. I would say a two-way participation, but also in a different context. This is what I could say. Yes, you have mentioned Grete Mosley in the local context when she played a very important role. And thanks to one of the research line, investigation lines we started in Chile, we were able to detect some of the reasons, coming back to the original question, some of the reasons on why Chile. And we understand that Grete Mosley played an important role in convincing certain authorities from the UNESCO so that Chile were the elected country hosting this instance. And this is why it is important to remember that role, and also the look, Mario Vasquez's perspective, who not a long time ago died, and many of the people that were part of the table, that while being expert, it's also a different historical context from where reflection is built, heritage reflection is built. But nowadays, the call is different, the invitation is different to make communities be part of this reflection regarding their heritage and regarding how this heritage can be present in museums. In that sense, our next question: what changed from Santiago to present days through their resolutions? Was it, for example, where technological breakthrough or advancement or the implementation of bigger educational forces in museums, participative methodologies, even audience studies? Are they also part, or are they the fruit of that activities, or does it correspond to the implementation of the principles of the declaration, or they are part of different phenomena or factors?
I think Ana Maria would be more competent than I and me to say that, because she's a professional in the field. So she's only a few words as an observer of the evolution of museums since in the last 50 years. I think the importance of the Santiago Declaration is to be found in the fact that it is a reference. It is a reference. It is the first written word on this kind of ideas, but it was just the part of a movement which happened in the beginning of the 70s. After some experiences in the 60s, we had the General Conference of ICOM in 1971 in France, with a sort of internal revolution by young members of the profession who wanted to find other lines for their museums, because they were not satisfied of the old museums of the past and so on. And also at the same time, the beginning of the preoccupation for environment, for nature, environment, and so on, which in fact was the origin of the word eco-museum, even if the eco-museum have changed since then. But at that time, the idea was to orient the museum towards more environment, nature, and so on. And third, the Santiago Declaration. And then a few experiences, a few projects, like the one I was involved in Le Creusot in France, which led to the birth in the 80s of the so-called international new museology movement, MINOM, who was an attempt to give, through various declarations, always inspired by the Santiago Declaration, the Quebec Declaration, another declaration in Mexico, in Mexico country, and it started mostly in the beginning of the 70s, and then it was a movement from inside the museum and heritage, the professionals, including volunteers, including activists from heritage, including communities. At the time of the fight in the Latin American countries, the fight for more community consciousness and so on, which led naturally, led to what we call now community museology, eco-museum, community museum, indigenous museum, and so on. So that's my reading of the evolution since in the last 50 years. Now Anna Maria can say what it is now, how she lives with that.
Cute. Bueno, honestamente yo creo
Well, honestly,
que hasta el día de
I
hoy
think that
hay muchos museos
until today there are several museums and several museologic projects and workers who are not aware of the declaration. And I mentioned this idea again, Leonardo mentioned this idea at the beginning, this idea about the romantic character of it. It might be around this document, because I have experienced that in the field, in territories that even as of the 70s started, well, some museums started, some community museums started, like it might be the Aysén region here to the south of Chile, and museum with such a big impact in the rural areas. Well, let's say that the declaration as an instrument for international relations in the museums were not that known, or is still unknown somehow, but the effect it has was really known. as well as the principles being mentioned. I do believe that with the Santiago Roundtable Declaration, we got a phenomenon, an important one, which is the application due to a network, due to a replication. Then networks of museums are generated, such as the Community Museums Network in America, whose basis are in this declaration, and some others came after it. And it is these museums networks that under these principles start to perform a model towards other community museums, which take this as a reference and start to work under these criteria and principles. Therefore, and I believe that we need to be realistic in that sense, because the declaration itself, it's an international instrument we have in museology, but it's not binding in terms of it cannot be monitored, or it's not tracked, it's not coercive in any way, but it's a manifestation of principles. Well, during the conversation we can touch on that, but the challenge comes from here, and how or what can we do so that what's contained in there continue to be transformative and interpreted in the coming 50 years. And to sum up, the declaration, well, the contribution, the biggest contribution is the concept of integrated museum. And for the first time, a museum where, let's say that in the past we talked about the pillars of the museum, of their museologic functions, which were the conservation and were the communication and the exhibition and diffusion and dissemination of it. Now we are talking about other pillars, which are territory, heritage, and community. It's not that the declaration has obviated the traditional museologic function that were understood from this type of institution, but now they added a sense, and it also enabled the provision of a track, of a path, of a way to talk about how museums relate to the problems they had at that time and we still have. Although, well, the declaration presents these conceptual advances, which are a milestone for Latin American and international museology. Around the implementation, we can also talk about exhibitions to make an emphasis on this. I believe that it was the mobile exhibitions, the concept, where exhibitions expressed problems from the rural world, that training were conducted, new technologies were incorporated, but they just mentioned the alignments, the guidelines, but precisely on how to work on it at a museum, at a great scale museum, that was going to be developed later and in practice. So in that sense, I would say that the impact came from the example, the network movement generated later, and we still continue to reinterpret, and as the word ecomuseo has been reinterpreted by many people, the Santiago Roundtable Declaration, as well as the integrated museum concept, have the nature and the identity of each staff from the heritage, understanding it in their own context. This is what I can say. Absolutely, the possibility we have now to commemorate the Santiago Roundtable opens us the possibility to reflect upon other emerging topics. It is not closed in its context. Conversely, it opens to other contexts. And I would like to mention here that the way two people I missed when making the introduction, but they are important in the light of this introduction. Lucio Lara from Mexico, he also cooperated and actively works with community museums in Mexico. And Armando Perla, who from Canada has different development and work in museums from the sexual dissidences, which also have to do with emerging topics, and it also reivindicates this table. And in that sense, the question is the knowledge of the territory in the field in situ, and that community was necessary for museology 50 years ago, among other topics, of course. Which are the challenges in this sense at present?
It is a few. At that time, 50 years ago, what was important in museums, in museology, was a collection, and the scientific discipline. I remember my predecessor at ICOM, Georges-Henri Rivière, always referred to the museum disciplines, the basic disciplines, mean art history, ethnography, archaeology, history, musical instruments, I don't know, all kinds of things, but always based on the type of collections and the reference to an academic discipline. So that was the museums were defined by their belonging to a certain discipline. So the notion of territory, the notion of the place, the environment of the museum, practically was never expressed at that time in the ICOM meetings, in the UNESCO meetings, and so on, except the national, or even sometimes regional reference. A museum could be a regional museum because it belonged to a certain smaller region, smaller than the national level, or national. It was a question of greater identity, so to speak. So the notion of the relationship between a museum and the population, not talking about community, but the population, was looked at essentially for as an educational tool, because the children of the population, within the population, were invited to go to the museum and to benefit from museum teaching. But it was museum teaching, what Paulo Freire calls the banking education. I mean, the museum educators told the children, through directly or through their teachers, told the children what they should look at, why they should look at it, and why it was beautiful, or it was interesting, or it was scientific, and so on. That was a one-way communication. And so this, we must realize what it was. And in countries like India, for instance, where museums were essentially tourist institutions, which were there to attract people. In Africa, exactly the same. In Africa, the National Museum of Benin, Dahomey at that time, in Porto Novo, was opened with free entrance, and it was visited by local people who were curious to see what was a museum. But when the director decided to put an entrance fee to the museum. Only foreigners coming with pleasure or tourist boats visited it. So it was really the relationship with the local population, practically didn't exist. And the notion of public referred to either an educated public, people able to understand what was behind the museum collections and the museum exhibitions, or visitors coming from abroad, tourists. So we have to think, in my opinion, that my interpretation, that this notion of territory, which appeared in Europe mostly in the 70s, and then later became very, very important. But in Latin America, I think happened through the communauté de base, the communities which fought for local development, fought against dictatorship, and so on, for the rights of the ethnic groups, and so on. It's the same in Canada or in the States. Then became the idea of the cultural living heritage of these communities. It started with the communities, it didn't start with museums. It started with the communities, which became interested in their heritage. So it's not, we should not look at the museums as a sort of uniform movement, even if there is an International Council of Museums, even if UNESCO has a view, an overall view of museums as an institution, as a world institution, like there is a world culture. It's not the same. There was a world of museums, that's ICOM, that came from the 19th century, then the 20th century. But now there is the other movement coming from the communities, more active in the communities where there is already a consciousness of the local culture, living heritage. And in other, like in my country, when the local development movement were started in the 1970s, then the idea of the importance of local heritage, not the big monuments, not the big museums, but the small local initiatives, became really important, vital for the real what we call local development. So this is again my interpretation. The challenge for the museums is to keep this vitality of the community initiative, community capacity to decide for themselves how they should manage their own culture, their own heritage, their own language, their own everything, their own identity. This is the challenge. Museum is only a tool, is not the world institution, which it's a tool, and I think it's an evolution of this small movement led by a few people in Santiago in 1972, which now has changed, has moved, has evolved in many directions, and which had created the need for the tools, which are community museums, etc. The big museums, it's another problem, which is another speech, another domain completely, because they have their own problems.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Ana Maria, go ahead, the floor is yours. This is a question on the challenges, right? At the time, I was analyzing the different issues that existed, and it's not that we're so far away. Museums should respond, and I tried to think about the different points that were pain points at the time, and personally I do need, well, I'll later speak about how museums respond to these challenges. And one of those points is what we currently call the triple crisis, or the triple planetary emergency. The triple planetary crisis, which talks about climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and pollution. And this leads me to thinking, in addition, because we're talking about territory, about the issue of degradation, for example. Wars. And from the times of the Round Table up to now, well, between 50 and 60 years ago, one of the major conflicts that have existed within nations has been the conflict for land, right? Territory, and the defense or advocacy of territory. Just to mention a couple of cases. In Colombia, since January until April, 50 social leaders have been murdered because of the advocacy of land, which is endangered due to extractivism. And another issue, besides from this one, which I do believe is very important, but it's one of the issues where museums are they have great accountability as agents, is the issue of isolation and what happens in isolated territories, which is all these have been subject to the consequences of centralism, in Latin America, many countries, and this leads to connectivity issues, to the lack of accessibility, access to basic services, access to education, participation in educational and cultural activities. And the situations I'm mentioning are quite interconnected and make museums respond differently. And I want to reach this point now. It has to do with museological functions. Sorry, I have an interference, so I'm going to use my... Okay, better now. Thank you. Museological functions and how museums respond to these challenges and how they did respond. For example, here in the region of Aysén, there's 27 museums, community-based museums, and within them there's a group that, based on the needs of connection of the territory, the needs of social integration, and the strengthening of tissue per se, due to this historical isolation, this intertwine, there's been museums that have created different strategies to fill in certain gaps that exist. In fact, they turn into municipal invasions, for example, when they're managed by a municipality. And these museums, there's a model that I call the Ayséan model from Aysén. It's museums that are created along with a community library, with a local radio, and a tele-center, remote center. And with that, these museums use the link, or they use it to hook you to collections and the management of community heritage in order to challenge all these needs in a safe space, which is the museum. Therefore, these museological functions that they developed and the museums of the region of Aysén are currently developing are an example of how, in the face of challenges for the protection of nature, of an ecological awareness that is generated in a region with so much biodiversity. It is the third water reserve in the world globally, right? So how, in the face of these scenarios, museums present all these museological functions that are alternative? And I believe that in the face of all these issues and needs that we have as a society, that is an example how to address this, how to repropose all those museological functions without this meaning that the museum is going to turn into another type of institution. Because I spoke about this issue with Leo and Hughes, how to make the museum continue being a museum and how to differentiate from other types of institutions as well, just like a school, a gym, a church, different institutions that maybe have other types of social purposes. I think I mentioned many ideas now, but I mixed many issues, many topics. But that is my reflection regarding the challenges and the methodological functions that are needed to address this. Yes, thank you very much, Ana Maria. Well, the truth is, we exceeded a bit our time. Time flies, right? And well, to conclude this panel, I'd like to invite Hugh and Ana Maria to give us, in 2 words, which is a very complex challenge, and just give us 2 closing words. No, not 2 words, but anyway, how to make the future declaration that we can maybe generate now in 2022. How can we make it a binding instrument for the future? Or is that utopical?
The future is to Ana Maria. Ana Maria is the future. I'm not the future. So she should first answer.
En 2 palabras, al menos 4 palabras.
At least 4 words, right?
Por ejemplo, aquí,
For example, here in the region of Aysén, the museums network generated a declaration of network working. We created that declaration in 2018 based on the principles of the Santiago Roundtable. Therefore, many museums installed this in their own activities based on this and in their own philosophy. So I really think about the network effect, and this is not a binding declaration. If it's a tough law, in terms of international relations, right? There's nothing better that can change this soft law. The network effect will apply this. This will be much more powerful than a mere declaration of principles. And hopefully in the future, and we talked about this, we could probably have a convention of museums, something that speaks about international issues and more binding issues of monitoring, generating incentives for all this to continue the next 50 years to come, because it's not like oh, 50 years pass and then we're ready. No, we still have 50 more years, so we need to see our forecasts and our projections for the future. So that's my 2 words. Thank you very much for your 4 words. Hugh, do you want to add something?
Just 1 sentence before giving back the floor to Ana Maria, because she should end it. She should be the last one to speak. But just one thing which I always tried, a question which I always asked in all the missions I had for accompanying museums, local museum, eco museum in the last 30 years. My interpretation 50 years later of the Santiago Declaration is to change a little bit the declaration from the idea of the social, le muséum intégral, etc. Is just a question. Is that museum useful to its population, for its population? How can it be more useful to the population? That's all. That's the only question I always ask. And it is, in my opinion, and in something which too often, especially in the traditional museums, the professionals tend to forget, because they serve their collection, they serve research, they serve academic, they serve education, they serve the traditional educational ways, but it's very difficult for them to think in terms of the usefulness of their institution, of their collection, of their exhibition, and so on, for the actual population which surrounds them. That's all. I'll end with that. Ana Maria, what do you think about that?
Thank you very much, sir. I do believe that the question, we'll keep it open because we have more sessions or panels to come, 6, 7, and 8, where we can continue proposing these same questions that are quite necessary, right? Thank you very much, Hugh de Varin. Thank you very much, Ana Maria Rojas. As our president very well says, we will continue. Thank you very much. That was a quite interesting dialogue with the voices from Coyhaique, Paris, and Santiago de Chile. Thank you very much, Hughes, again, Ana Maria and Leonardo. It's not a coincidence that we're celebrating this in Centrogam, a building that in 1972 hosted the third conference of the UN on Trade and Development, also known as UNCTAD 3. We would like to invite Jiménez Villanueva Garin, Director of Communications of Centrogam, to tell us a bit more about the history of the space that's currently hosting us through the UNCTAD 360 experience. Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you about a digital project. And I have some notes here in pen and paper. We've spoken much about why the Santiago Roundtable was hosted in Chile. Which is a cultural center that is specialized in scenic arts. So why are we organizing a museum encounter in a cultural center? You'll probably be asking yourself that. And one of the answers is that this was one of the many headquarters of the Santiago Roundtable, and it was here in this building, right? The other one has to do with the other reason has to do with the project that I will now introduce, which is this 360 tour on how this building used to look like in 1972. And we'll be able to see what is left of the collection, even what disappeared from the collection. And my third answer is that the history of the building, something Felipe mentioned a bit of the history, right? And there's other lectures, and this has to do with the story of this building, and I'm going to briefly explain this to you. This building was inaugurated in 1972 for UNCTAD 3. It was built in 275 days, and it had to host 3,000 delegates. That's why we built it. We didn't have such a building in Chile, which is a quite small country, but it was a titanic effort. And we were able to inaugurate it on April the 4th, half a century ago. And 3 months ago, during 3 months it operated for UNCTAD. The architects that worked for this building, they had two difficulties. Not only did they have to create it for UNCTAD 3, but they had to see what would happen with that center later. And the aim was to build a cultural center, and it was called Gabriela Mistral. Gabriela Mistral is a poet, a Nobel Prize of Literature, and the center was led by a woman, Ilma Cáceres, and there's 1 year, and then we had the military coup, and since the presidential palace La Moneda was bombarded, the military board, they took this building, they changed the name to Diego Portales, which was an authoritarian minister from our history, and was characterized for maintaining just order in the country. So from Gabriela Mistral, the poet, it started to be called Diego Portales. And here the military board, they took this building as a headquarters. They worked like that until 1980, when La Moneda was restored and the palace, and then they started governing there again. But here we had the tower, which is the Ministry of Defense was here in the tower, and in the building we had the legislative branch. In 1978, in this same building, it was announced, there's a quite important event for Chile. They announced the referendum that gave place to democracy in Chile. They announced the results, and this later turned into a convention center where they held seminars, lectures, etc. In 2006, part of the building caught on fire. And with that, we started questioning what would happen with this building. And in the government of Michelle Bachelet, we decided for this building to go back to its origin and for it to be a cultural center, which is called Centro Cultural Gabriela Mistral now, also known as GAM. And it was an architectural project, Bicentenario, to celebrate the 200 years of the independence of Chile. Now, this story is told in a much more entertaining manner here in this video. Years.
Now we'll talk about the project. I would like to explain before these images that have made you understand what we are going to delve into. That was done by Daniel Molina. It took him 12 years of research. You may imagine what it means to rebuild a building that was built in 275 days. From the technological standpoint, it means to work with the changing technology year by year, and also to conduct a very deep research with architects, artists. Just to mention one example on how Hugo Baviera, on how they work at that time, one of the architects told us that he worked, for example, in the morning. He talked to the engineers. The engineers made them comments. He integrated those comments in the afternoon, and at night that prediction was to be worked on. So architecture was parallelly being worked with construction. So to reconstitute this, he had to study very deeply. He did that with David Mauland, and as I said, there was 12-year research, and we could wonder today why practically being obsessed by building not only that functioned or worked for what you saw in the screen, what referring to the details, why focusing on the art collection. Half of the art collection vanished during dictatorship, and why exploring each of these details. I got a privilege to be in Pompeii, and when I was there, I got obsessed with details on why people lived like that, from mural creations, the way they contacted to their environment, and finally they didn't do much different from what we do today, from what we live today, which is basically well-being, beauty, contemplation. I know that this comparison might be kind of arbitrary because we are referring to a 50-year building, and Pompeii, you know, it's Roman ruins. But I like to invite you to this journey along with me, and why we believe that it is important, such reconstruction. Let's see this from the very beginning. That's the entrance. On the left, you'll see the Alameda, or one of the main streets, one of the main avenues. As a matter of fact, the main avenue in Santiago. This Alameda has hosted fights against conquerors, Mapuches. Today we got celebrations, soccer match celebrations, and that was what it was. There was a staircase, a solemn staircase, accessing the central hall. You can see the architecture with transparencies, palm trees were concepts worth mentioning. We still have them here. There's plenty of living because it was meant as a meeting center for delegates, international communication, and then around culture. You can see one of Roberto Mata's paintings, and here is a signage. It's not a minor thing to mention. It was carried out by 3 female designers, and they were students, and they had to stop studying at the university because that gave them a lot of work. It was very time consuming. The signage needed to be useful for 140 delegates, and they had to shorten the translation. And that's a detail, a piece of detail I have to ask you, because I want to reinforce the efforts it took to reconstruct the building, even until the details. Let's see Mr. Ponce's work. We saw in the first picture this piece of work. You can see it when entering GAM. Let's get out. And we'll go to the conference hall. As you can see, it's a roof which is pretty similar to other GAMS rooms for performing arts. The furniture were used when it was called Diego Portales, and it is still used today. All rooms holds pieces of work. In this case, you can see the Luz Donoso project. I'm forgetting now the name. Mr. Millar. Okay. Some of the pieces of work have vanished, like Paulina Brugnoli's work. And here one of the meeting centers. It was a pretty innovative architecture. It might be used today in 2021 without any problem. It's a pretty futuristic architecture. You can see exhibitions, Mario Toral exhibition. Let's see if I can zoom in. Yes. Mario Toral. Héctor Herrera and Mario Carreño exhibitions are all there. There's several halls that hosts Eduardo Vilches' work. There's a replica at the Ministry of Culture in Valparaiso. From GAN, we have done a huge work to recover the missing works. We have seen some. Guillermo Núñez, Luz Donoso. This is Lucy Rojas' work. That was difficult to restore because artists themselves do not even remember because there's no designs about it. What you see now at the reception is by Germán Aristizábal, one of the least known. Here there are 4 entrances. Here you will see José Balmes, and then Gracia Barrios, and the lamps you can see fine today at the cafeteria. Juan Egenau doors, these are the ones part of the access to the Popular Art Museum. One more access, you'll see the chimney by Felix Maluenda. That's Nemesio Túnez, one of the missing arts. The layout was changed during dictatorship. This part of the building is pretty valuable. We'll see it, which is the north axis. Where you will see Federico Asle's work. You can see the architecture that's open and connected. All this was connected to the street. This sculpture exists today. It was restored and it was again open in 2013, but it had to be closed because the Great Hall construction. There's no access today, but we do hope to open it soon, pretty soon. We also have the Fourth World sculpture. One more missing sculpture. That was the way with a water source for the fontaine. Now, due to the media biennial and a joint work, today we can have a replica or reproduction in front of the tower. We could see a lot of details in this tour. Blueprints are over there. Corridors can be seen, can be walked on. Access to spaces and also translation. Translation was very cumbersome, and architects had to work a lot to have these translation rooms or simultaneous interpretation rooms. The Canteen is a pretty iconic place because it provided lunch for 3,000 people, the delegates. And then when it became Metropolitan Cultural Center, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks were served, and it closed at midnight. Basically, servings for 300 people were needed. Let me show you the dining room and the cafeteria, which is the last part of my talk. This is the cafeteria. As you can see, different shapes, different spaces, so that people can share. That was the canteen. You can see the fish. It's a replica, but we placed at the Plaza Central a fish made by an artisan from Chimbarongo, a place in the central area of Chile. There's plenty of replicas. They are interesting based on what we were talking before from the Latin American popular and contemporary arts in this building. And finally, I like to show you the embroidering, Isla Negra embroidering. We take pride in it. I'm looking at it in the missing works, but let me tell you that it's not missing anymore. You see, and we are happy to have them back. It was missing for 49 years. And it was restored, and it was placed over there during the celebration of 50 years of the building. You can see the vision of the embroiderers on the work of fishing during daylight, at night, agriculture, work at the binders, and mining companies or mining sites. You can see that in the building B, openly for everyone. To us, it is very important to be with you here, using this digital platform, enabling the breaking of barriers in a spatial and space. People from the south of Chile, people from outside Chile are connected through these platforms. And this project, the BEATS project, allows us to see the status of the building in 1972. Besides, we can have access from anywhere. The connection towards architecture, or from the architecture with the environment, we believe it to be very relevant. And I believe it relates with what this cultural center is at present. We paid an homage on April the 3rd. The homage with the participants of the building, and they were very happy. But I would say, and personally speaking, what made me happier was looking at them when they hugged each other and how they re-encountered, they reconcile with their memories, with their personal memory, with their work. Many of them haven't been to this building for 50 years because they had hard feelings due to history, but paying an homage to them and having the embroidering back again and having this tour back allowed them to reconcile with their work and with the work with others. That is, it was not a disposed work. It was a work that we today at this room, pretty similar to one of the rooms where Francisco Brugnoli had one of his pieces of work. That's another missing work. All this work was not disposed of. We are standing on We are on foot on the foundations, and that's where the beauty lays for this building. Reminding or remembering the story and projecting ourselves from here, obviously we all work for the history heritage. And one of the last questions was, what's the contribution museums can make? We are talking about an open museum inside a cultural center. What's the contribution from museums to population? It has to do with taking a look at the past, project ourselves so that new generations can internalize this collective work by respecting it and being able to update it with experiences from today's Chile. They are probably similar problems to the ones faced in 1972, but under a different context, a completely different context in technology and in a context of new ideas, such as owls being mentioned today, related to communications, territories, and above all, ecology. So that beauty, if we go back to Pompeii, I would say that this building has history, and this history makes it beautiful to have you all here to talk about the past and how to project it towards the future. I'd like to thank ICON. Of course, I thank universities, UNESCO, libraries. All this is a collective work. It not only has to do with the work done by David, but it also had to do with all the file work done by National Library, Santiago Library. It's also a collective work. Also thanking Felipe Mella for trusting us in this project and helping us with the outreach. And thank you very much. Good Santiago Roundtable for everyone. Thank you very much, Jimena, for sharing this platform, enabling to travel to 1972 and tour this majestic building. After knowing the Untitled 360, welcome, we're going to welcome Daniela Millalea, singer, Mapuche singer, descendant from immigrants arriving in Santiago by the late 19th century. In 2013, she launched her first work called Transfund. She has composed music for the Mapuche theater and audiovisual project. Her proposal mixes the root Mapuche music. Welcome, Daniela.
Hola, Mari.
Sur donde llueve a diario y respiro el
y volver a nuestras tierras, vivir la ribera cerca del Tolte. Y en el gris inerte nosotros danzamos en luz de luciérnaga, luces de asfalto, recordamos nuestra esencia. Y con cada beso juntamos los libros en nuestras maletas para volar juntos de regreso a nuestra tierra y volver, cosechar la siembra, salir de proletas y volver a nuestras tierras, vivir la ribera cerca del Tolte, cerca del Tolten, cerca del Tolten. Cerca del Tolten. Bueno, ahora sí, ¿cómo están? Agradecida de la invitación, agradecida de poder estar aquí cantando para ustedes. Y bueno, como decían, mi nombre es Daniela Millaleo, soy cantautora de origen mapuche. Y soy cantante también de protesta, así que les vienen estos temas que son un poquito para no olvidar, ¿no? Estamos hablando de historia. Esta canción yo la hice hace muy poco, es una canción que se llama Piedra Herida. La traducción de Catrillanca al castellano es piedra cortada. Bueno, esta piedra es una piedra que está herida. Es una canción dedicada a Camilo Catrillanca. Que hacía el mal, lo publicaron en la prensa, mientras la ciudad se despertaba la conciencia, y entre sus hermanos el odio se hizo profundo, como la herida que dispara el verdugo. Una madre llora lágrimas de injusticia, sus cabellos trenzan realidades no admitidas del sueño profundo que arrebata la codicia. Sangre derramada en nuestra tierra invadida. No se han de callar los gritos del amor de su firme caminar. No volverán a callar su dolor como quien romperá con balas a una piedra Esta piedra herida la enterramos en la tierra, como quien siembra por amor y no por guerra. Y florecerá la lucha en nuestra memoria, que perdurará en el camino de la historia, cuando por las calles gritemos por Catrillanca. Hermanas y hermanos que han caído en la desgracia, no olvidemos nunca quién fueron los asesinos, y en sus manos sangre de todos los oprimidos. No se han de callar los gritos del amor, de su firme caminar. No volverán a quebrar su dolor como quien romperá con balas a una piedra. ¿Cómo estoy de tiempo? Súper, porque quiero contar una cosita antes de irme con esta última canción y agradeciéndole a ustedes de nuevo. Es importante, sumamente importante el trabajo que hacen los museos, sabiendo que yo soy mapuche y tenemos una especie de relación de amor y odio, ¿no? Una pequeña anécdota que no es anécdota, sino que en 1788 por ahí se llevó a cabo la campaña del desierto en Argentina por el Mapu, y bajo también esa misma, y contemporáneo también fue la ocupación de la Araucanía. En Argentina, Roca y un tal Perito Moreno raptaron a la familia de Inacayal, Lonco Inacayal, de la Pampa, con el Lonco Foyel y toda su familia. Fueron llevados al Museo de la Plata y fueron expuestos vivos. A la familia le enseñaron a sacar la piel de los huesos y fueron expuestos muertos. Hace 4 años aproximadamente, y en petición de las comunidades, pudieron recuperar el cuerpo del Lonco Inacayal, y fue con una gran ceremonia enterrado en su tierra. Los mapuches tenemos esa relación con el museo. Sin embargo, yo que he tocado en un montón de museos, entre eso el Museo Procolombino, hemos tenido ese diálogo recíproco del saber que no tan solo aquel cántaro, aquella joya o aquel chimamul que está en ese museo es una pieza, más bien es un ancestro.
Objects is just a piece, they are ancestors, and this is the dialogue we are having with the dialogue. So I appreciate telling this in this place. Thank you very much, and I say goodbye with this song.
Así que Chaltumay me voy con esta canción. Ay, tormento de yo ser indio, ay, qué vacía, vacía vida. Ay, maldito que fue aquel día, qué osadía, nacido indio, nacido indio, nacido indio. Ay, cuidado, ay, balayuta, los policías, maldito el día. Ay, maldito Ay, dime dónde está mi hijo, que está herido, ay de cañón, ay de cañón, ay cuidado, ay va la ayuda, los policías queman mi casa. Ay, digan dónde está mi hijo, que está herido, muerto de cañón. Maldito el día, maldito el día, maldito el indio, indio que soy. Chaltumay, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias Daniela Millaleo por su presentación musical. Así llegamos a la fase final de este hito de lanzamiento, revisiones del pasado, problemáticas del presente y desafíos del futuro.
Present and futures for the future, meeting and critical role from museums and the Caribbean to the world. But we just closing the first session. We will present you the fall. They will be presented through UNESCO channel. On June 6, we'll get the panel 50 years from the Santiago Roundtable, and now what? Dialogue experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean, organized by the Austral University of Chile. This meeting will have Lisandra Camis, director of the museum and University of the West, Ingrid Barbados, Regional Museums and Community Museums Program, Museum Nacional de Retiro, Sergio Mosquera, founder and director of the Memoria Center from Colombia, Angelica Navarrete, director of the Cultural Center Museum of Moltume, Chile, Samara Pérez, in charge of the El Mate Museum of El Blanco, El Chile, and Marcel Solar, director of the Social Upheaval Museum, Chile. On June 6 at 2:30 p.m., we'll have the workshop Museums and the Linkage to Permanent Education, Balance and Future Look for Latin American, organized by the Universidad de Chile and their museums. Registration are open at the website of the activities. On June 7, we'll have Utopia, Ideologies and Social Historical Context of the Santiago Roundtable, from Development to the Good Living, organized by Lab Museums of the Universidad de Chile. The activity will have the participation of Jacques Junhab, Director of Studies of the High Studies of Social Sciences in France, Cultural Manager and author of the program Points of Culture Brazil, Benedicta Delgada, director of the Tucumán, Peru Museum, Teresa Morales, coordinating committee of the Community Museums Network in Mexico, Luz Arias Estrada, director of the Gráfica Chillán Networks of Museums El Nuble, Chile. On the same Tuesday at 2:30 p.m., we'll listen to the words of children and youngsters of the Future Voices activity organized by the Mirador Interactive Museums. Finally, on June 8th at 2 p.m., we'll have the free lecture Grete Moto Museums, Territories, Communities, and New Museologies, organized by ICOM Chile and the National Historical Museum. On the table about territories and communities, new museologies and new problems, we'll have the participation of Veronica Estafora, Ethnographic Museum Juan Bautista Ambrosetti from Argentina, Neris Mora, Despierta Hermano Museo from Malagua, Chile, Hemblem Joseph, International Coalition of Awareness Sites, United States. The last session of the lecture will be dedicated to the museums and the climate change. In order to have a dialogue on the above, we have invited to Cynthia Velázquez, National School of Conservation, Restoration and Museography from Mexico, Verónica Gagerio, Ethnographic Museum Juan Bautista Ambrosetti in Argentina, and Carlos Rojas from the National Historical Museums of Chile. With this, we have started the act of commemorations for the 50 years of the Santiago Roundtable. We invite museums and communities from everywhere to register the activities at the website museoschile.gov.cl/Mesa Redonda de Santiago. We remind you that in a couple of minutes of the Central Hall, Central Yard of GAM, will have the tour on how to remember a crime anti-tree, a project with the purpose to reflect, problematize, and do a memory exercise in relation to history, which have been hosted in the building. Those who are not still registered may ask about some still available vacancies. On behalf of the Regional Office for Education for Latin America and the Caribbean of UNESCO, of the Chilean Committee of Museums Icon Chile, the Ministry of the Cultures, Arts, Heritage and GAM Center, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to have you in the virtual activities on June 6, 7, and 8 to continue rethinking of museums and their relation with society. Have a nice afternoon.